911 call came in from an unlisted number at 2:15 a.m. It seemed like any other emergency, but it vanished from the log just moments later. What followed next was a mystery that no one could explain. Before we dive in, imagine getting a call in the dead of night, one that disappears from the records. What would you do? Stay tuned because this is one mystery you don't want to miss. It was an ordinary night in the small, sleepy town of Ravensbrook, the kind of night where the moon hung low, casting long shadows on empty streets, and the air felt thick with the promise of something unsettling. At the Ravensbrook 911 dispatch center, Officer Kelly Patterson had just finished her routine shift check. It was late, well past midnight, but the night had been eerily quiet, the usual hum of late-night emergencies absent, the kind of night where a dispatcher could almost forget the weight of the world outside, lulled by the silence. But at exactly 2:15 a.m., everything changed. The phone rang. Kelly, groggy from a long shift, reached for the receiver with a quiet groan, half expecting it to be another drunk dialing or a wrong number. She didn't expect it to be an emergency, not on a night like this. The voice on the other end was faint, barely a whisper, but the fear in it was unmistakable. "Help me," it said, the words a jagged rasp of panic. For a moment, Kelly thought she heard the caller crying. There was something about the voice, something in the tremor, that made her sit up straight, pushing the fatigue aside. This wasn't a prank call. She tried to ask for details, but before she could get another word out, the line went dead. Silence. At first, she sat there staring at the receiver, unsure what had just happened. Was it a wrong number? A glitch? She quickly checked the caller ID, but it was unlisted. No number, no location, no history, nothing. Her instincts kicked in. As a dispatcher, she had seen it all. The frantic calls, the strange ones, even the occasional hoax. But this felt different. The urgency in the caller's voice stayed with her. The desperation, the raw terror. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, pulling up the location for an emergency dispatch. Something was pulling her to this. She couldn't explain it, but she knew the call had come from somewhere far beyond the town's limits, from a place few people even remembered. The address, when it came up on the screen, was an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of Ravensbrook, a place that had been empty for years. Why would anyone be calling from there? Her mind raced. Should she send officers? It seemed out of the ordinary. But something wasn't sitting right with her. Against her better judgment, she sent a squad car out there. The officers, she knew, would be skeptical. They would wonder why anyone would be calling from an empty farmhouse, a place abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. But Kelly couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She stared at the dispatch screen, waiting for any update. There was a flicker of uncertainty, an eerie, palpable tension that seemed to hang in the air. The clock ticked, but time felt different. Stretched thin, her pulse quickened. It wasn't just the call that unsettled her, it was the silence after. Then the phone rang again. Kelly's hand trembled as she picked up the receiver, the faint hum of static crackling in her ear. "Hello?" she said, trying to steady her voice. There was a long pause on the other end, and then, just as before, a voice. But this time it was even more distorted, the words slurring together in an unnatural way. "It's too late," the voice rasped, as if it had been dragged through layers of distortion, each word broken, stretched until it lost meaning. Kelly's breath hitched. It was the same voice, but now it sounded like a warning, like whoever was speaking knew something she didn't. "Who is this?" Kelly pressed, hoping to gather more information, but the line suddenly cut off, leaving only the sound of dead air. Kelly felt a knot tighten in her chest. She checked the log again, but this time something was wrong. The previous call, the one that had come through just moments earlier, was gone, vanished. There was no trace of it, no record on the system. It was as though it had never happened. She scanned the monitor, her fingers moving frantically over the keyboard, trying to pull up the details. But the call had disappeared. She even checked the system's history. There was no entry, no log, no hint of what had happened. The timestamp read 2:15 a.m., but that was it. The call was gone. How could that be? This wasn't just some technical glitch. She knew it. Something was wrong. As a dispatcher, Kelly had dealt with enough calls to recognize when something wasn't right. This was different. The eerie sense that something was hiding beneath the surface crept in, gnawing at her. What was going on? Why had the call vanished? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker on the screen. A small line of text, barely noticeable. She leaned in closer. The log entry had been updated, not with any new calls, but with something strange, a new timestamp. 2:20 a.m., 5 minutes had passed. But the call that had come in at 2:15 a.m. was nowhere to be found. Kelly sat back in her chair, the weight of the moment settling on her. The tension, the unease was growing. She thought of the farmhouse, the abandoned place on the outskirts of town. The officers had been dispatched, but they hadn't checked in yet. She felt her gut twist. Something was pulling at her, a feeling that she couldn't explain. Another phone call cut through her thoughts, shattering the silence in the room. But this time when Kelly answered, there was no voice, Just static. The line buzzed with an eerie hum as though something was there, something trying to get through. She tried again, but the static only grew louder. Then at the edge of the buzzing, she thought she heard it. A whisper, barely audible, a faint sound creeping through the line. They're coming. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same one. The voice from the first call. The voice from the farmhouse. Kelly's blood ran cold. How could this be happening? The officers were supposed to be on their way, but what if they had already arrived? What if they were caught in something far darker than she could imagine? She clicked through the dispatch logs again, but the record of the call continued to shift. The timestamp kept changing, the entries fading in and out. No one could explain it. No one could even try. Her hands shook as she stared at the screen. She knew she had to act fast. Something wasn't right. Something beyond her control was taking place, and whatever it was only just beginning. But as she picked up the phone again, the call log refreshed, and the system blinked a final time. The call history was gone, completely erased. The screen, the log, everything, as if the event had never occurred. But deep down, Kelly knew. She knew this wasn't a coincidence. This was something much worse, something that had already started to unfold, and she had no idea how to stop it. Kelly's mind raced, trying to make sense of the disappearing call log. The events unfolding before her felt like something out of a nightmare. She couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her chest, the gnawing sense that something dark was taking hold. There had been so many strange elements to this. The distorted voice, the unlisted number, the sudden disappearance of the call records. But there was no time to dwell on the confusion. The officers needed her. She quickly typed a message to the officers on the way to the farmhouse, urging them to report in immediately. Seconds passed, then minutes. Still no update. The silence hung in the air like a thick fog. She stared at the screen, her fingers frozen above the keyboard, caught between her training and an overwhelming feeling that something was horribly wrong. The clock ticked. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. Just as she was about to dial the officer's phone line again, a loud crash echoed from the receiver.
Kelly jumped, the sudden noise shattering the stillness in the room.
It wasn't the kind of noise she was used to. It sounded as if something heavy had fallen in the farmhouse, followed by a muffled shout. Panic surged in her chest. She could hear the urgency in the officers' voices. "We need backup," one of them yelled. The words came through the line, but they were laced with fear, something she had never heard from the team before. Kelly's heart skipped a beat. What was happening out there? She immediately hit the button to broadcast the call to the police chief's office, sending the signal to the station. There was no time to wait. As she waited for a response, her eyes darted over the console in front of her. It was a maze of flashing lights, lines, and static, but one thing stood out. A strange entry in the 911 log. It was another timestamp, but this time it was different. 2:45 a.m. The officers had just gone silent on their end. That timestamp, she knew, didn't match the flow of the calls at all. This wasn't just a log error. It felt like a deliberate alteration, a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. She picked up the phone and dialed again, but before she could even hear it ring, the line clicked. An eerie hum buzzed in her ear, as if she were listening to a radio frequency tuned to the wrong station. Kelly's stomach churned as she tried to make sense of the noise. It wasn't static, it wasn't interference. It was something else entirely. Something sentient, almost like a presence reaching through the wires. Her grip on the phone tightened as she spoke into the receiver. "Officer Davis, this is Kelly Patterson. Come in." For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then a whisper broke through the noise, a voice so faint she almost couldn't hear it. "We're trapped." The words sent a cold shiver down Kelly's spine. This wasn't just a call for help. This was a warning. "Trapped? What's going on?" Kelly pressed, her voice trembling. She heard something like a door creaking, followed by a soft rustle as if something was moving through the dark, unseen. Then a low voice answered again, but this time it was distorted, garbled, almost impossible to make out. "The house won't let us go," the voice rasped. Kelly's eyes flicked to the monitor in front of her, where the timestamp for the 2:45 a.m. log entry flickered once more before vanishing, replaced by yet another entry, 2:50 a.m. A strange chill crept down her back. It was like time itself was unraveling. She grabbed the phone again, dialing the police chief's office, but the call wouldn't go through. The line was dead. She was alone with the static. As the seconds dragged on, a sense of helplessness washed over her. She had to act fast. She grabbed her personal cell phone and dialed the number for Officer Davis's partner, Officer Roberts. But when the call connected, it wasn't Roberts who answered. It was someone or something else. The voice on the other end was soft, slow, and deliberate, with a rasping, guttural tone that sent a surge of terror through her. "You shouldn't have listened," it whispered. "It's already here." The phone call abruptly ended, leaving Kelly in stunned silence. What in the world was happening? She'd dealt with emergencies before, but this was something else entirely. A feeling of dread hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like something ancient and malevolent had awoken. She stared at the phone in her hand, her heart pounding, when the emergency dispatch screen blinked again. The timestamp had changed once more. 2:55 a.m. But this time, the name associated with the log entry wasn't an officer's name. It wasn't even a name Kelly recognized. It was a name that seemed to jump out of the screen. D. Anderson, the same name she had seen before. The name that had appeared in the earlier call logs that had mysteriously vanished. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized something far more disturbing. The name wasn't just a coincidence. She had seen it before, a few years back, when a similar case had taken place. A missing persons case involving a young man who had disappeared without a trace, only to be found later in a remote part of the woods. His body, well, it was never fully recovered. Kelly had seen the reports, the news stories, but no one had ever solved the mystery of what happened to him. And now his name was appearing in connection with these strange calls. Was he somehow involved in what was happening at the farmhouse? Had he been drawn into this just like the officers? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden burst of static on the radio, followed by a scream that tore through the air. Kelly's blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was Officer Roberts, but the scream wasn't one of fear. It was a desperate cry for help, a primal scream of someone who knew they were facing something beyond their control. Without thinking, Kelly slammed the phone down and immediately dispatched a second team to the farmhouse. But as she did, she couldn't shake the image of the officers' faces when they had first received the call. They had been reluctant to go. She had pushed them, not fully understanding the danger they were walking into. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Her fingers hovered over the phone, but before she could make the call, the system flickered again. The screen went black for a split second, and then a new entry appeared in the log. It wasn't a timestamp. It wasn't even a name. It was something far worse, an address, the very same farmhouse. The log read, "They're still here. They never left." Kelly's heart thudded in her chest as she felt the walls of the dispatch room close in around her. Whatever was going on at the farmhouse, whatever was happening to the officers, it was something no one could explain. But it wasn't just a simple emergency call. It was a force far darker, something beyond comprehension, and it was already too late to stop it. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The farmhouse wasn't abandoned. It was a trap, and the officers had unknowingly walked right into it. What was happening there? What was unfolding in the darkness was something no one was prepared for, and Kelly was the only one left who knew. But even she didn't know how to save them. Kelly felt the air grow heavier as the minutes stretched on, each one more suffocating than the last. The reality of what was happening became clearer with each passing second, and the magnitude of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. The officers were still out there, trapped, terrified, and possibly already caught in whatever dark force was at play in the farmhouse. She couldn't stay idle, but every effort she made to reach them was thwarted. The radio had gone silent. The calls were coming in more sporadically, and each log entry seemed to warp the timeline even further. Every time she looked at the dispatch screen, the timestamp changed, as if time itself was being manipulated by whatever presence had taken hold of the house. She tried to reach out to the second team she'd dispatched, but there was no response. Only more static. Only more unanswered questions. The farmhouse, once a simple abandoned structure, now seemed to loom over her thoughts, an oppressive, suffocating presence that was creeping into her mind. She thought about the history of the place and the rumors, the whispers of something unnatural, something that had been there long before the house was abandoned. Some said the land was cursed, others said it was the site of an old tragedy, a dark secret buried deep in the soil. No one knew for sure, but Kelly was starting to believe that whatever haunted that place was far more than just a rumor. She turned back to her console, her mind running on overdrive as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The call logs had stopped updating, but the timestamp was stuck on 2:55 a.m., and the name of the mysterious person, D. Anderson, kept reappearing. The same name, the same link. It was as if the past was bleeding into the present, connecting the missing person case with this new, inexplicable crisis. How could Anderson's name be appearing now? Was he somehow involved in the events unfolding at the farmhouse? The silence in the room was deafening. Every time she looked at the screen, the text seemed to blur, like something was interfering with her vision, pulling her attention away from the cold reality before her. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to her like a heavy fog. She needed to make contact with the officers. She needed to know what was happening, needed to understand what they were facing before it was too late. Kelly's hands shook as she reached for the emergency radio again. But before she could press the button, a new call came in. She almost jumped out of her seat. Her breath caught in her throat as she grabbed the receiver. The voice that came through was weak, barely audible, and it took her a moment to recognize it. It was Officer Davis. Patterson, he rasped, his voice strained, the words coming out in broken breaths. You have to help us. It's not what we thought. It's here. Kelly's heart pounded in her chest. What's going on, Davis? She demanded, her voice trembling. Where are the others? What happened to Roberts? There was a long pause on the line. She could hear the faint sound of breathing on the other end, the heavy, labored breaths of someone who was struggling to speak. Then his voice came through again, quieter this time, almost like a whisper. We can't leave. It's all around us. We tried to get out, but the doors won't open. The windows, they're sealed shut. No matter what we do, we can't get out. We can't. The line crackled with static, and Kelly felt the panic rising in her chest. Davis, you need to get out of there now. But the response she received wasn't what she had hoped for. I don't know if we can. His voice was barely above a whisper now, drowned in a horrible sense of defeat. We tried everything. We're not alone here, Patterson. The house, it's alive. We're stuck here. It knows we're here, and it's not going to let us leave. Kelly's mind reeled. What do you mean it's alive? What's happening, Davis? His voice faltered. I don't know. It's like something is in the walls. It's in the air. It's watching us. Every corner, every shadow. It moves when we do. We can't escape. I don't know how much longer we have. Before Kelly could respond, the line went dead. She stared at the receiver in her hand, the silence ringing in her ears. Her thoughts were spinning. Was it really possible? Could the farmhouse be some sort of sentient entity, a place that fed on its occupants, trapping them within its walls? She tried to call back, but there was no response. The line was completely dead. Desperation clawed at her, and she started typing frantically into the dispatch system. She needed to reach someone, anyone, but nothing. No update, no signal, no sign of the officers. It was as if they had disappeared into thin air. Her gaze flicked to the log again, her mind desperately trying to make sense of the growing mystery. The timestamp had shifted once more. Now it read 3 a.m. The hours seemed to stretch out of sync with the real world, as if time itself had fractured, slipping further from her grasp. The name D. Anderson flashed on the screen again. This time, the name was accompanied by something new, an address. The same farmhouse, the same cursed place, but this time the address was connected to a chilling message. They never left. They're still here. The walls in the dispatch room seemed to close in on her. Sweat beaded on her forehead as the realization sank in. The officers were trapped. The house had claimed them, just like it had claimed Anderson years ago. The message was clear. No one left the farmhouse. No one ever did, and now it was coming for them all. Just as she was about to send another request for backup, her phone rang. She hesitated for a moment, the air growing heavy with dread. The caller ID was blocked. Her heart skipped a beat. She picked up the phone, her hands shaking. Patterson, she said, trying to steady her voice. The voice that came through was unmistakable. It was Officer Roberts. But something was wrong. His voice was hoarse, strained, almost unrecognizable. Patterson, it's too late. We should have never gone in. It's not just a house. It's a trap. It knows what we're afraid of. It's changing us. Kelly's pulse raced as she pressed him for more details. What are you talking about? Where are the others? Roberts' voice was a whisper now, filled with terror. We tried to run, but the house, it's not just holding us here. It's taking us one by one. We hear them. The others, they're still here. They're calling out, but they're not themselves anymore. The line went silent. Dead air. Kelly's stomach churned. The last thing she heard was a faint, almost imperceptible sound in the background. A faint tapping like footsteps in the dark. Everything she had feared was happening. The officers were no longer just missing. They were being consumed one by one. The farmhouse wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, a dark force that devoured everything that came into contact with it. And soon it would come for her. There was no way out of this. No escape. It was too late. The house had already won. But Kelly refused to let them die in vain. She knew she had to do something, anything, before it was too late for everyone else. She wasn't just a dispatcher. She was their last hope. She would find a way to save them, or die trying. Kelly's pulse hammered in her ears as she gripped the receiver, her mind spinning. The sense of dread had transformed into an overwhelming urgency. Officer Roberts' voice, hoarse and broken, echoed in her mind. It's too late. We should have never gone in. She replayed those words over and over, her breath shallow, a deep fear clawing at her chest. Whatever was happening inside that farmhouse was no longer something she could ignore. It was real. It was happening right now. She glanced at the dispatch screen again as though it might offer some explanation, some way to help her make sense of the chaos, but it only gave her more confusion. The timestamp had shifted once again, but now it read 3:15 a.m., and the name D. Anderson appeared with new urgency. The log entry wasn't just a name anymore. There was a brief message attached to it. It won't stop. We're all part of it now. The words seemed to taunt her, mocking her helplessness. How could this be happening? How could something like this even exist? Was the farmhouse truly alive, as Davis had suggested? Was it drawing in the officers, feeding on their fears and slowly consuming them until there was nothing left? Kelly gripped the edge of her desk, fighting back the rising tide of panic. She couldn't let fear take over. She had to think. She stood up from her chair and paced the room, trying to make sense of the madness unfolding around her. Her mind went to the missing persons case involving D. Anderson. She had read the reports, but the name had never been connected to any of the bizarre occurrences surrounding the farmhouse before. Now it was front and center, and it seemed like the key to understanding everything. The farmhouse wasn't just some place of horror. It was part of a bigger, darker puzzle. It had been waiting for someone, for anyone, to walk into its trap. And now that the officers were there, trapped within its walls, it had them. Every moment that passed was another moment they slipped further away from reality. The house, whatever it was, had them now. Kelly snapped back to the present, grabbing her phone with trembling hands. She dialed the police chief's office again, but as expected, there was no answer. The line was dead. She tried the backup numbers she had, each time growing more desperate. There had to be someone who could help, but as the minutes ticked by, she was no longer sure that anyone could help them. The officers were too far gone. The farmhouse had already claimed them. Then another call came in. This time Kelly didn't hesitate. She grabbed the phone quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Patterson," she said, her voice sharp, trying to mask the fear she felt.
Hello?
The voice on the other end was crackling, distorted, but Kelly could make out a few words. We're trapped. It's getting darker. Can't see." It was Officer Davis again, but this time he sounded different. His words were fragmented, as if his mind was starting to break. He was no longer speaking in coherent sentences. His voice, once so full of authority, was now filled with dread, nearly unrecognizable. Kelly's heart sank. "Davis, what's going on? Where's Roberts? Where are the others?" she demanded, trying to keep her composure, trying to keep him talking. She needed information, but there was no answer. Only a deep, unnatural silence that filled the line, thick and suffocating. It lasted for what felt like an eternity before a faint whisper reached her ears. "They're changing. The house is taking a..." And then the line went dead again. Kelly's stomach turned over. They were losing them one by one. It wasn't just the house that was a threat, it was something worse. The farmhouse was feeding off their fear, bending their wills, turning them into something different. The officers weren't just trapped. They were becoming part of the house, part of whatever dark force had possessed it. She slammed the phone down, trying to steady herself. There was no more time to waste. The situation was spiraling out of control faster than she could keep up with. It was no longer just about saving the officers. It was about stopping whatever was happening at the farmhouse before it spread beyond that place. Her mind raced with the possibilities. If the farmhouse had this power, if it could reach out through the 911 system, manipulate the logs, control time, then perhaps it could do more. Could it spread further? Could it affect the town, the people in it? The thought chilled her to the bone. Kelly's thoughts flickered back to the old case file she'd read years ago, the one involving D. Anderson. The file had been closed without resolution. The authorities had never figured out what had happened to him, but now she was starting to piece it together. Anderson had disappeared years ago near the farmhouse. The connection was undeniable. The farmhouse had claimed him just like it was claiming the officers. She couldn't wait for backup. She had to act, now. Without thinking, Kelly grabbed her jacket, throwing it over her shoulders as she rushed out of the dispatch center. She wasn't sure what she hoped to accomplish, but she couldn't stay here. She couldn't sit idly by while the officers were being consumed by the very thing she had once dismissed as a ghost story. She had to see the farmhouse for herself. She had to find a way to stop it, whatever it was, before it was too late. As she drove through the empty streets of Ravensbrook, her headlights cutting through the dark, she felt a growing sense of urgency, a sharp tension in her chest. The town was eerily quiet. It was almost as if everyone had disappeared. There were no cars on the road, no sounds of life. It was as though the darkness was swallowing everything, leaving only the weight of her thoughts and the distant sound of her tires crunching over gravel. When Kelly finally reached the outskirts of town, she could see the farmhouse in the distance. It was exactly as it had been described in the reports, a dilapidated, decaying structure standing tall in the middle of nowhere. The windows were boarded up, and the front door hung slightly ajar as though inviting her in. She parked her car and approached cautiously, the air growing heavier with each step she took. The wind howled, sending shivers down her spine. The house seemed to groan as though it were alive, waiting for her. She knew she was stepping into something she couldn't control, something far darker than she had ever imagined. But there was no turning back now. The officers were trapped inside. She was the only one who could help them. She just had to figure out how. The door creaked open as she stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. But it was the silence that struck her most. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive. Every step she took felt heavier, like the house was pulling at her, drawing her deeper into its grip. She forced herself to move forward, ignoring the cold sweat on her skin, the increasing sense that something was watching her. And then she heard it, a whisper, low and menacing. It came from somewhere deep within the house, like the walls themselves were speaking. Kelly froze, every muscle in her body tensing. The whisper came again, and this time she could make out the words, "You shouldn't have come." She didn't know if it was the house, or something worse, but she knew one thing for certain, she wasn't alone. With a final deep breath, Kelly pushed forward, determined to face whatever lay ahead. It was now or never. Kelly's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped deeper into the farmhouse. the oppressive air seeming to weigh on her every step. The silence was unbearable, almost suffocating, and the whisper, that faint, otherworldly whisper, clung to the corners of her mind. "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed in her ears, and she had to shake the fear off. There was no turning back now. The officers, her colleagues, were trapped somewhere inside, and she was the only one left who could help them. She didn't know what force had a grip on this house, but she was going to find out. The walls of the farmhouse seemed to close in around her as she walked, the creaky wooden floors groaning with every step. The dust in the air felt thick, like it had been disturbed only by the slow march of time. Every room she passed seemed to stretch endlessly, as though the house was infinitely larger on the inside than it appeared on the outside. It was a maze, each turn taking her further away from the front door, further away from the safety she had left behind. But there was no going back now. She had to find the officers, or at the very least find some way to stop this nightmare. She turned down a narrow hallway, the dim light from her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the peeling walls. The air was colder here, colder than it had been outside, and her breath fogged in front of her face. It felt as though the house itself was breathing, exhaling a cold, unnatural chill. The whisper came again, this time more distinct. "Leave now." Kelly's pulse quickened, but she kept moving forward. There was no voice on the other end of the whisper, no figure she could identify, but it was unmistakable. It was as though the house itself was alive, aware of her presence, and determined to make her leave. But she refused. She had a job to do. She had to find the officers, find out what had happened to them, and get them out. The hallway led to a small door at the end, cracked open just enough for her to see a dim light flickering within. She approached cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The moment her fingers touched it, the door swung open on its own with a loud creak, revealing a room filled with dusty furniture and old, tattered curtains. But what struck Kelly immediately was the presence of something in the center of the room, a large wooden chair facing away from her. It seemed ordinary enough, yet it emanated an odd energy, an unnatural force that made her skin crawl. Without thinking, Kelly stepped into the room, her flashlight illuminating the chair. As she got closer, the chair shifted, creaking as though something had moved within it. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and she could feel the temperature drop, the air becoming even more oppressive. She forced herself to move forward, her legs feeling heavier with every step. As she reached the chair, her heart skipped a beat. Sitting in it, slumped forward, was Officer Roberts. His uniform was disheveled, his face pale, but it was not the officer she had once known. His eyes were wide open, but there was no recognition in them. No sign of the man she had worked with for so many years. His expression was vacant, as though his soul had been drained from him, leaving nothing but an empty shell. Kelly stepped back, a chill running down her spine. Was this what the house had done to him? Had it turned him into a mindless puppet, bound to its will? She reached out to touch his shoulder, but the moment her fingers made contact, the air seemed to shift around her. The room grew colder and the shadows deepened. The whisper came again, louder now, and it was unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come." Suddenly, Robert's head snapped up, his eyes now wide and empty. His mouth moved, but the words that escaped were not his own. They were a low, guttural growl, filled with an unnatural distortion. "We are part of it now. We are its servants." Kelly stumbled back, horror flooding through her veins. It wasn't Roberts anymore. Not truly. He had become part of the house, just like the others. The officers were being consumed, their identities erased, replaced by whatever force was controlling this place. The farmhouse wasn't just trapping people, it was changing them, turning them into something else, something monstrous. Her breathing quickened as she turned to leave, but as she did, she heard it, the sound of footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate, dragging footsteps that seemed to come from all directions. She spun around, but the room was empty. No one was there, yet the footsteps continued, echoing through the house. Before she could react, a figure emerged from the shadows, another officer. But this time it wasn't someone she recognized. It was another uniform, another face, but the eyes were vacant, empty, soulless. The officer reached out a hand toward her, and Kelly recoiled, instinctively stepping back. His voice was barely more than a whisper, distorted and warped. "You are too late." Kelly's breath hitched as the officer lurched forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. She turned to run, but the hallway that had once been clear was now blocked. The walls seemed to close in, the space growing tighter and tighter until she was trapped. Her heart raced in her chest as the officer continued to move toward her, his footsteps growing louder, the sound of his breathing growing more erratic. She turned back toward the door, her mind scrambling for an escape. It was as if the house itself had become a maze, shifting around her, trapping her in its grip. The walls felt alive, pulsating with an energy she couldn't understand. It was no longer just the officers she was fighting against. The house itself was her enemy now, and it was determined to claim her as it had claimed them. "Leave now," the whisper came again, louder and more forceful, reverberating through the walls. The voice wasn't just in the room with her anymore. It was everywhere, in the walls, in the floor, in the air. It was the house speaking to her, urging her to leave, to give up. But Kelly refused. She couldn't leave. She wouldn't leave without answers, without the officers, without a way to stop whatever this place was. The officer reached her, his hand outstretched, his breath ragged. Kelly lashed out, her hand gripping the flashlight tightly, and she swung it at him, knocking him back. For a moment he stumbled, but then he recovered, his movements more fluid, less human. His jaw dropped open, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and a guttural growl rumbled from deep within his chest. Kelly's heart raced, her mind screaming for her to run, but she couldn't. She couldn't let herself be consumed by this nightmare. She glanced around, desperately searching for anything that could help her escape. But the room seemed to warp, the door nowhere in sight. The house had already claimed her. There was no escape, only darkness. And then, as if the house itself had heard her thoughts, the lights flickered once more. And this time, when they came back on, the room had changed. The officer was gone. The walls, the furniture, even the very air around her had shifted, like a twisted reflection of reality. Nothing was as it seemed. Kelly staggered backward, her legs giving way beneath her as the house began to close in. She was no longer in control. The farmhouse was alive, and it was coming for her. Before she could move, the darkness swallowed her whole. Kelly's senses went numb as the darkness consumed her. It was as if the very air in the room had solidified, pressing down on her chest, stealing her breath, suffocating her. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and for a moment she thought she might pass out. But she didn't. She fought against it, shaking her head, trying to clear the fog that clouded her vision. She had to keep moving. She had to find a way out. But the darkness wasn't just a lack of light, it was something more sinister. It was alive, wrapping around her like cold fingers, pulling her deeper into the house's embrace. Every step she took felt like walking through molasses. The very walls seemed to bend and stretch, their shapes warping, distorting as though they were made of something far more dangerous than wood and plaster. There was something wrong with the air too, thick, almost tangible, with a chill that didn't belong. The whispering had returned, louder now, reverberating through her bones. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was not just a warning now, it was an accusation, a taunt, as if the house knew her deepest fears, knew that she was trapped. Kelly's heart raced as she stumbled forward, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. Her flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the warped walls. And then, just as suddenly, the light went out. Darkness. She froze, holding her breath, waiting for the room to shift again, for the walls to close in. But nothing happened. The whispering had stopped, and for a moment the house seemed to hold its breath as if it were waiting. Kelly's mind raced. She couldn't stay in the dark. The darkness itself was part of the house. She knew that now. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for the flashlight, trying to twist it back on. The cold metal felt foreign in her hands. Her fingers were numb. But then, as if the house itself were mocking her, the light flickered back to life. And what she saw made her blood run cold. She was standing in a hallway that wasn't there before. The walls, once cracked and weathered, now seemed slick, moist, like something living. The floor beneath her feet was covered in a thick, oily substance that left her shoes sticky with each step. And in front of her, at the far end of the hallway, was something worse than any monster she could have imagined. It was a figure, no, not a figure, a shape, but it was a shape made of shadow, a dark mass that seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally, as though it were not bound by the laws of physics. It pulsed with a deep, almost rhythmic energy, like a heartbeat in the dark. And within the shadow, Kelly saw eyes, many eyes. They glowed faintly, like embers in the night, and they were all staring at her. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to move, but her legs refused to obey. It was as if the house had taken hold of her, holding her in place. The figure, or whatever it was, began to move toward her, its form shifting and undulating with each step. The sound of its movement was like a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in her bones. The whisper returned, louder now, echoing in her skull. "You belong to us now." The voice was not just in her ears. It was in her mind, crawling through her thoughts, twisting her reality. Kelly wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't think. Her mind was foggy, overwhelmed with fear and the unnatural presence of the shadow. The figure in the darkness loomed closer, and she could feel its presence as if it were an invisible weight on her chest. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The house was alive, and it was closing in on her, slowly, methodically, and then, just when it felt like the walls would crush her, the shadow spoke. Its voice coming from every direction at once. "You cannot escape." The words were like a slap to her face. cutting through the fear and leaving her breathless. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. The cold, the pressure, the suffocating weight of the house, it was all too much. But as the figure drew near, she noticed something. A faint light in the distance, a crack in the dark. It was so small at first, so far away that she almost didn't believe it was real. But it was. With all the strength she had left, Kelly took a step forward, then another. The darkness seemed to push back against her, trying to keep her in place. But the light grew stronger with every step. It beckoned her, promising escape. For the first time since she had entered the farmhouse, Kelly felt a surge of hope. The shadow seemed to resist her movement, its form shifting and writhing as though it were trying to reach out and pull her back. The whispering became deafening, louder and more insistent. But Kelly didn't stop. She couldn't. She had to reach the light. Finally, she reached it. The moment her hand touched the glowing crack, the house seemed to shudder violently, as though it had been struck. The darkness wavered for a moment, and then, with a deafening crash, the shadow dissolved into nothingness. The walls around her began to warp, the house groaning as if it were dying. The light spread, pushing back the dark, illuminating everything in its path. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the light began to fade. The house, now empty of the shadow's presence, started to crumble. The walls split open and the floor beneath her feet cracked. It wasn't over, not yet. The farmhouse was still fighting back, desperate to keep its grip on her. Kelly's heart raced as she stumbled backward, trying to find her bearings. She could hear the sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. Was it another officer? Or was it something worse? Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but she couldn't. Her legs refused to move. The house was closing in again, the darkness creeping back, the whispers returning. "You will be ours." But then, just as she thought the house had won, she saw it. A faint silhouette in the distance. A figure standing in the doorway, a figure she knew all too well. It was Officer Davis. His eyes were wide, filled with terror, but there was something different about him now. He wasn't entirely himself. He had become part of the house, part of the darkness. But he was still reaching for her, still trying to save her, despite what he had become. The whispers grew louder. "Leave." Kelly's mind raced. Was this the moment she had feared? Was she destined to join the ranks of the lost? To be consumed by the darkness that had claimed so many before her? She couldn't let that happen. Not without a fight. With a final burst of strength, Kelly broke free from the house's grip. She sprinted toward the doorway, toward Davis, toward whatever salvation she could find. She didn't know what was real anymore. She didn't know if she could trust her senses, but she knew one thing for certain. She had to leave. She had to escape before the farmhouse consumed her entirely. As she reached the doorway, the house let out a final guttural cry, a sound that seemed to shake the very earth beneath her feet. The walls collapsed behind her as she crossed the threshold, and for a moment Kelly thought the world was going to swallow her whole. But then, everything stopped. The air was still. The silence was deafening. Kelly stood on the threshold of the farmhouse, her body trembling with exhaustion. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing whatever was left inside. The farmhouse had been defeated. She had escaped. But as she stood there, breathing heavily, her eyes scanning the now silent field before her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her out. Something had been waiting for her to leave. And as the whispers faded into nothingness, a thought lingered in the back of her mind. Maybe the farmhouse wasn't finished with her yet. What do you think happened inside that house? Do you believe the officers are truly gone, or is something still waiting for them? And for Kelly? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life horrors. You never know what's out there lurking in the shadows.